The air over the Corvery River did not just shimmer, it burned. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon on May 4th, 1799, and the sun hammered down upon the Deccan Plateau with a ferocity that rivaled the artillery fire of the preceding weeks. On the banks of the river, concealed within a network of zigzagging trenches, thousands of men pressed their bodies against the hot earth, waiting for a signal that would likely end their lives. The temperature hovered above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, a suffocating blanket of heat that turned the wool coats of the British infantry into torture devices. Soldiers from the Scottish Highlands, the Swiss Regiment de Meurant, and the Sepoy battalions of the Madras Army lay shoulder to shoulder, sweating, praying, and checking their flints. Across the shallow rocky bed of the river stood the prize, the island fortress of Seringapatam. For weeks, this granite behemoth had defied the British Empire. It was the capital of the Kingdom of Mysore, the lair of the man the British feared more than any other ruler in India, Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. The air in the trenches was thick not only with humidity, but with a pestilential vapour. The British camp, holding the largest army the East India Company had ever assembled, some 52,000 men, was rotting from the inside out. Dysentery tore through the ranks, and the stench of unburied bullocks and decaying offal drifted from the rear lines, mingling with the sharp, sulphurous tang of black powder. For the men of the Forlorn Hope, the suicide squad volunteering to lead the assault, the waiting was the hardest part. They knew that just a few hundred yards away, behind those battered ramparts, lay an army of 30,000 defenders. These were not undisciplined rabble, but soldiers trained in French tactics, armed with muskets and the terrifying Mysorean rockets, iron-cased projectiles attached to long bamboo poles that shrieked like banshees as they tore through the air. The British had faced these rockets before, watching them erratic arcs sow chaos among the cavalry. Today, however, the British relied on a different kind of fire. For the past week, the heavy siege guns, massive 18 and 24-pounders, had pounded the northwest angle of the fortress wall. Day and night, the iron shot had smashed against the masonry, slowly pulverizing the granite until a jagged, dusty slope of rubble appeared. This was the breach. It was the only way in. Lieutenant General George Harris, the pragmatic commander of this grand army, had made a calculated gamble. Conventional military wisdom dictated an attack at dawn under the cover of cool greyness. But Harris and his second-in-command, Major General David Baird, chose the blinding heat of midday. They wagered that Tipu's defenders, exhausted by the siege and oppressed by the sun, would be resting, eating, or seeking shade, never expecting the redcoats to charge at the hottest hour of the day. In the trenches, Major General Baird checked his sabre. For him, this was personal. Years earlier, he had rotted in Tipu's dungeons for 4 agonizing years, chained in a cell not far from where he now stood. Today, he would lead the storming party. Behind him, in the reserves, waited the 33rd Regiment of Foot, commanded by a 30-year-old colonel named Arthur Wellesley. Wellesley, who would one day be known to the world as the Duke of Wellington, was currently recovering from a humiliation. Just weeks prior, during a night reconnaissance at the Sultanpetta Tope, he had become disoriented in a bamboo grove and lost his men in the dark. The future Iron Duke was anxious to redeem his reputation, but today he would have to wait in support, watching as Baird led the charge into the fire. The silence of the afternoon was unnatural. The roaring of the breaching batteries had ceased, leaving only the buzzing of flies and the rushing water of the Corvery. The river was surprisingly low, knee to waist deep, a stroke of luck that the engineers had confirmed only hours before. The stage was set. The chess pieces, regiments from halfway across the world, and the fierce defenders of Mysore were locked in position. The British Empire was about to throw everything it had at the walls of Seringapatam in a bid to break the deadlock of southern India forever. Baird stepped up to the lip of the trench. He looked at the men of the Forlorn Hope, their faces grime-streaked and stoic. He drew his sword, the steel glinting violently in the midday sun. The time for siegecraft was over. The time for the bayonet had arrived. At exactly 7 minutes past 1, the signal was given. A single shout echoed down the line, followed instantly by the roar of thousands of boots hitting the parched earth. The forlorn hope, that band of doomed volunteers seeking glory or death, surged up from the trenches and sprinted toward the riverbank. Behind them, the main columns of the British assault force, red-coated infantrymen and kilted Highlanders, poured out like a crimson tide. The silence of the scorching afternoon was shattered not by a gradual crescendo, but by an immediate, thunderous explosion of movement. The soldiers hit the water of the Corvery River with a splash that seemed to wake the very stones of Seringapatam. As the engineers had promised, the water was low, swirling around the knees and waists of the struggling men. But the riverbed was a treacherous gauntlet of slippery granite rocks and shifting mud. Men stumbled under the weight of their muskets and ammunition pouches, fighting to keep their powder dry as they waded through the current. For a few breathless seconds, it seemed the gamble had paid off completely. The ramparts remained silent, the defenders seemingly paralyzed by the audacity of a midday assault. Then the fortress erupted. The walls of Seringapatam, looming high above the river, suddenly bristled with smoke and fire. The Mysorean defenders, shaken from their rest, rushed to the parapets. A storm of lead rained down upon the exposed troops in the river. The water, moments ago clear and rushing, began to froth with the impact of musket balls. The distinctive, terrifying shriek of Mysorean rockets tore through the air. These iron-cased missiles, stabilized by long bamboo poles, erratic and unpredictable, skimmed over the water and exploded among the tightly packed columns, sending plumes of water and shrapnel into the ranks. The British artillery on the far bank answered, firing over the heads of their own men to suppress the defenders on the walls. The air filled with the deafening counterpoint of siege guns and the crackle of thousands of muskets. In the river, the advance did not falter, though the cost was immediate. Soldiers fell silently into the current, their bodies drifting downstream, while their comrades stepped over them, eyes fixed on the breach. The heat, already oppressive, was now compounded by the suffocating smoke that began to drift across the water, obscuring the fortress walls in a grey haze. Leading the charge, General Baird was a conspicuous target, urging his men forward through the splashes of enemy fire. The attackers knew that speed was their only armour. To stop in the river was to die. They scrambled up the opposite bank, boots sliding on the wet mud, and reached the foot of the glacis, the sloping bank leading up to the fort's outer ditch. Here, the terrain became even more unforgiving. The breach, created by days of relentless bombardment, was a steep, jagged scar in the fortress wall. It was a chaotic pile of shattered masonry, loose granite boulders, and dry dust. There were no ladders, no organized paths. The men had to climb, clawing with their hands and driving their bayonets into the debris for leverage. From the top of the breach, the defenders fired straight down into the faces of the climbing British. Officers waved their swords, indicating the path upward, only to be cut down in the opening volleys. The colours of the regiments, the flags that served as rallying points, bobbed violently as the ensigns carrying them struggled to maintain their footing on the shifting rubble. The forlorn hope had done its job. They had absorbed the first shock, their bodies now littering the slope, paving the way for the heavy infantry pressing up behind them. The British line, a mix of European regulars and Indian sepoys, became a singular, desperate organism pushing upward. They were no longer marching in formation. They were a mob of red and white, driven by drill and adrenaline, clawing their way toward the sky. They could see the faces of the Mysorean soldiers now, peering over the broken masonry, aiming their muskets, readying their spears. The distance closed to yards, then feet. The sounds of mechanical warfare, the cannon and the musket, began to give way to the brutal, intimate sounds of human struggle. The clash of steel, the thud of rifle butts, and the shouts of men fighting for a foothold on the edge of India. As the first wave of British infantry crested the summit of the breach, the battle devolved into a suffocating crush of bodies. There was no room for the disciplined volleys that characterized European warfare. Here, on a precarious slope of shifting rubble, it was a test of raw strength and desperation. The defenders of Mysore, realizing that their outer wall had been compromised, fought with the ferocity of men protecting their homes, slashing down with curved tulwars and thrusting with long pikes. But the momentum of the assault was inexorable. Driven by the pressure of thousands of men pushing up from behind, the leading British soldiers were physically shoved over the parapet and onto the ramparts proper. General Baird, covered in dust and sweat, achieved the summit and immediately sought to bring order to the chaos. The plan, conceived in the safety of the command tent, had to be executed now in the bloody reality of the breach. The assault force was to bifurcate. Like the jaws of a trap, the army would split into two columns. The right column was ordered to sweep along the southern ramparts, while the left column would push north. The objective was to encircle the fortress walls and meet on the eastern side, sealing the defenders inside a ring of steel. The right column met with surprising success. The defenders in this sector, demoralized by the sudden appearance of the enemy and the ferocity of the charge, began to waver. The British troops, sensing the panic, pressed their advantage, driving the Mysoreans back along the narrow walkway of the walls. Bayonets did the work of bullets as the redcoats cleared bastion after bastion, the Union Jack rising steadily above the smoke of the southern defences. However, the story on the northern ramparts was markedly different. Here, the resistance stiffened into a solid wall of defiance. The left column found itself trudging into a storm of fire. Every traverse, the defensive barriers built across the ramparts to prevent enfilade fire, became a miniature fortress that had to be stormed at the point of the bayonet. The progress was agonizingly slow, measured in yards and lives. The reason for this fierce resistance was the presence of the tiger himself. Tipu Sultan had been taking his midday meal in a small gateway near the northern wall when the alarm was raised. Unlike many monarchs who might have sought the safety of the citadel or prepared an escape route, Tipu armed himself like a common soldier. Carrying a light musket and flanked by his most loyal attendants, he rushed to the point of maximum danger. For the British soldiers pushing north, the figure of the Sultan was likely indistinguishable in the smoke and confusion, yet his influence was palpable. Under his direct command, the Mysorean troops rallied. They fired down from the high walls and utilized the complex architecture of the fort to ambush the advancing column. The British advance stalled. The narrow confines of the ramparts turned into a slaughterhouse, with men firing point-blank into each other's faces. Below the walls, inside the city, the panic was spreading. Seringapatam was not just a fortress. It was a bustling metropolis, densely packed with civilians, merchants, and the families of the soldiers fighting above. The sounds of the breach, the screaming, the musketry, the roar of the victorious right column echoed through the streets, creating a terrifying cacophony. But up on the northern wall, the battle remained in the balance. The British, exhausted from the river crossing and the climb, were running up against the elite of the Mysorean army, led by a king who knew that surrender was not an option. Tipu fired his musket until it was empty, was handed another, and fired again, a singular point of resistance against the tidal wave of the East India Company. The heat was now at its peak, the stone walls radiating the sun's energy, baking the blood that slickened the stones. The tiger of Mysore was cornered, but his claws were still sharp. The stalemate on the northern ramparts was violent, but ultimately finite. While Tipu Sultan held the line against the left column with desperation and personal bravery, he could not see what was happening on the other side of his city. The British right column, having swept the southern walls with brutal efficiency, was now curving around the eastern perimeter of the island. The jaws of General Baird's trap were snapping shut. The defenders fighting alongside the Sultan suddenly found themselves in a hopeless tactical position. The enemy was no longer just in front of them. They were appearing behind them, their red coats visible through the smoke of the eastern bastions. The realization of this encirclement shattered the morale of the Mysorean troops. The disciplined firing lines dissolved into panicked clusters. Men who had stood firm against the initial assault now threw down their muskets and scrambled for the safety of the city streets below. The ramparts, once a unified defensive line, became a series of isolated, desperate skirmishes. Tipu Sultan, sensing the collapse, made a fateful decision. He abandoned the outer wall, intending to retreat to the inner citadel, a fortress within a fortress, where he could arguably hold out for days, or perhaps negotiate a surrender. He mounted his horse, a magnificent animal that seemed out of place amidst the grime and gore of the battle, and turned away from the parapets. However, the route to the citadel lay through a series of narrow gateways, choke points that were rapidly clogging with the detritus of a routed army. The location was the Watergate, a low, arched tunnel leading from the outer defences into the town. By the time the Sultan reached it, the gateway had become a scene of horrific congestion. Panicked soldiers, fleeing civilians, palanquins, and terrified bullocks were all wedged together in the dimly lit passage. The air in the tunnel was thick with dust and the screams of the crushed. It was no longer a military thoroughfare. It was a kill zone. From the ramparts above, British soldiers began to fire down into the mass of humanity stuck in the gate. There was no targeting, only the blind mechanical process of reloading and firing into the crowd. The noise was deafening, amplified by the stone archway. It was here, in this claustrophobic crush, that the ruler of Mysore was brought to a halt. His horse was shot out from under him, sinking into the mud and bodies. Tipu's attendants struggled to lift him from the fallen animal. He was wounded, a musket ball having struck him in the breast, weakening the man who had terrorized the East India Company for decades. Meanwhile, back at the breach, the reserves were moving up. Colonel Arthur Wellesley, commanding the 33rd Regiment, marched his men through the gap the forlorn hope had cleared. Unlike the storming parties, whose blood was up and who were scattered in the heat of the chase, Wellesley's men moved with the cold precision of a reserve force entering a secured zone. Wellesley's task was not to lead the charge, but to secure the victory. He observed the chaos spreading into the city, the looting, the fires starting to kindle in the thatched roofs of the lower town. His face, known for its stoic reserve, betrayed a grim recognition of the work to come. The battle was effectively won, but the slaughter was far from over. As Wellesley's boots hit the stone of the inner fort, the focus of the entire day, of the entire war, contracted to that single, bloody tunnel at the Watergate. The British soldiers of the 12th Light Dragoons and the infantry regiments were closing in, their bayonets clearing a path through the resistance. They did not know that the sovereign of Mysore lay wounded in the muck just yards away. The grand geopolitical struggle for the Indian subcontinent had been reduced to a dark, confused scuffle in a crowded alleyway, where the identity of kings meant nothing against the thrust of a soldier's steel. The exact moment of Tipu Sultan's death passed without fanfare or ceremony. In the suffocating gloom of the Watergate, surrounded by the groans of the dying and the thick smoke of spent muskets, the Tiger of Mysore was just another obstacle in the path of the looting soldiers. Weakened by his wounds, trapped beneath the weight of his fallen horse and the press of bodies, the Sultan attracted the attention of a British soldier, not because of his rank, but because of the glitter of gold. Tipu wore a sword belt richly studded with gems, a prize that caught the eye of a redcoat pushing through the crush. As the soldier reached out to tear the belt from the waist of the fallen man, Tipu summoned his final reserve of strength. He slashed out with his talwar, the curved blade cutting the soldier's knee. The retaliation was immediate and unthinking. The soldier levelled his musket and fired point blank into the Sultan's temple. The ruler of Mysore, the man who had corresponded with Napoleon Bonaparte and revolutionized rocketry in India, collapsed back into the mud, instantly lifeless. His body was quickly trampled by the panic that continued to surge through the gateway, buried beneath a mounting pile of corpses. Outside the gate, the battle was effectively concluding. The British flag flew from the ramparts, and the resistance had dissolved into pockets of surrender. But with the cessation of organized combat came a new, more chaotic phase: the sack of Seringapatam. The immense wealth of the city, the accumulated treasures of the Mysorean dynasty, was now at the mercy of 50,000 exhausted, adrenaline-fueled soldiers who had survived a brutal siege. As dusk began to settle over the island, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Major General David Baird established control of the palace. His primary concern was not yet the looting, but the location of the Sultan. Rumors swirled through the ranks. Some said Tipu had escaped to the interior to raise a new army. Others claimed he was hiding in the Zenana, the women's quarters of the palace. Baird, the man who had once dragged irons in Tipu's dungeons, now stood as the conqueror of his jailer's home. He needed proof that the war was truly over. Guided by terrified palace servants, Baird and a detachment of the 33rd Regiment made their way back to the Watergate. The scene that awaited them was dantesque. The sun had set, and the tunnel was pitch black, save for the flickering light of torches held by the search party. The stench was overpowering, a mixture of gunpowder, open sewage, and fresh death. The bodies were piled so high that the tunnel was impassable. The victors had to drag the dead away one by one to inspect their faces in the torchlight. It was a gruesome, laborious process. Soldiers, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces against the smell, pulled body after body from the heap. Finally, near the bottom of the pile, they found him. The body was warm, the eyes open. He was stripped of his turban and his jeweled belt, but the distinctive mustache and the amulet on his arm confirmed his identity. Tipu Sultan was dead. Baird stood over the corpse of his enemy. It was a moment of profound historical irony. The former prisoner now looked down upon the lifeless body of the tyrant who had imprisoned him. Orders were given to carry the Sultan to the palace in a palanquin. As the procession moved through the streets, the news spread like wildfire. The tiger was dead. For the British, it was the end of a decades-long nightmare. For the people of Mysore, it was the beginning of an occupation. But as the official business of identifying the king concluded, the unofficial business of the army began in earnest. The discipline that had held the British line at Malavelli and stormed the breach at Seringapatam evaporated with the setting sun. The city was cracked open, and the soldiers, driven by greed and the release of tension, fanned out into the dark streets. The roar of battle was replaced by the crash of breaking doors and the shouts of looters. Night fell over Seringapatam, but there was no darkness. The city glowed with the orange light of 1,000 torches and the flickering flames of burning buildings. The strict hierarchy of the British army, usually so rigid and unyielding, collapsed under the weight of victory. 50,000 men, British regulars, Scottish Highlanders, Swiss mercenaries, and Indian sepoys, found themselves masters of one of the wealthiest cities in the Orient. The result was an orgy of plunder that would stain the reputation of the East India Company for years to come. The wealth of Mysore was legendary, and reality exceeded the rumours. Soldiers smashed their way into the treasury and the private homes of courtiers, filling their pockets with gold mohurs, strings of pearls, and uncut diamonds. It was said that in the chaos, jewels of incalculable value were traded for bottles of arak or simple tobacco. A soldier might stumble out of a palace room carrying a solid gold plate, only to drop it in favour of a silk tapestry, unaware of the fortune he was discarding. The looting was not merely a financial transaction, it was a release of violence. The civilian population, trapped on the island, bore the brunt of this unchecked exuberance. However, amidst this breakdown of order, one man remained coldly focused on the future. Colonel Arthur Wellesley, who had commanded the reserve during the assault, watched the disintegration of discipline with disgust. To Wellesley, an army that looted was an army that could be easily destroyed by a counterattack, however unlikely that might be. More importantly, he understood that the East India Company was not just here to conquer. They were here to rule, and you could not rule a city you were busy destroying. The morning of May 5th brought little relief. The sun rose on a city littered with debris and hung over soldiers. General Harris, recognizing the danger of the situation, made a decisive move. He appointed Colonel Wellesley as the governor of Seringapatam, passing over several senior officers, including the hero of the assault, General Baird. It was a controversial decision, fueled perhaps by political connections. Wellesley's brother was the Governor-General of India, but it proved to be a stroke of genius. Wellesley wasted no time. He entered the city not as a conqueror, but as an administrator. His first orders were blunt and brutal. He set up provost marshals in the main squares and issued a proclamation. Any soldier found looting or harming civilians would be flogged or hanged. To drive the point home, he erected gallows in 4 prominent locations. By the afternoon of May 5th, the bodies of several looters were swinging in the hot wind, a grim testament to the new governor's resolve. He wrote to his brother, "I came in to take the command on the morning of the 5th, and by the greatest exertion of the others and myself, we have restored order in the camp and the city." It was a masterpiece of understatement. Wellesley was personally patrolling the streets, chasing down stragglers, organizing guards for the surviving members of Tipu's family, and securing the granaries to prevent famine. This was the crucible of the Iron Duke. The tactical failure at the Sultan Peta Tope had taught him humility. The chaos of Seringapatam taught him the necessity of absolute order and logistics. While Wellesley restored the city, the British soldiers began to explore the strange marvels of Tipu's court. In the music room of the palace, they discovered a bizarre mechanical organ known as Tipu's tiger. It was a life-sized wooden automaton of a tiger, mauling a prostrate European soldier. When the handle was cranked, the tiger roared, and the soldier wailed in agony. It was a physical manifestation of Tipu's hatred for the British, a toy designed to amuse a king who dreamed of driving the white invaders into the sea. Now, the British soldiers laughed at it, cranking the handle and mocking the dead sultan's impotent rage. The tiger was dead, and his toy was packed into a crate, destined for a museum in London, a trophy of a war that had changed the map of India forever. While the soldiers counted their gold mohurs and the officers debated the distribution of prize money, a quieter, more significant looting was taking place within the military storehouses of the fortress. The British had not just captured a city, they had captured an arsenal that rivaled anything in Europe. Inside Tipu's manufactories, Royal Artillery officers discovered a technology that had terrorized them on the battlefield: the Mysorean rocket. Piled in great stacks were over 600 rocket launchers and thousands of the iron-cased missiles. These were not the crude fireworks used for signaling in the West. These were sophisticated projectiles, utilizing propellant compacted inside iron tubes to generate pressures that cardboard casings could never withstand. They had a range of over a mile, tumbling through the air with a terrifying instability that broke cavalry charges before they could begin. The British officers, pragmatic men of science, did not destroy these weapons. Instead, they catalogued them. They packed samples into crates alongside the jewels and the tiger automaton, shipping them back to the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich in England. It was this specific plunder that would lead directly to the development of the Congreve rocket, the weapon that would later glare red over Baltimore and scorch the battlefields of the Napoleonic Wars. The fall of Seringapatam had just inadvertently armed the British Empire for the next century. Beyond the walls of the arsenal, the political map of the subcontinent was being redrawn with ruthless efficiency. The kingdom of Mysore, once the dominant power of the Deccan, was dismantled. The British East India Company, operating with the cold logic of a corporation, carved up the territory. The Nizam of Hyderabad, the British ally whose cavalry had ridden alongside the Redcoats, was given a substantial slice of the pie, territories to the north that would buffer his own borders. But the company kept the choicest cuts for itself: the fertile coastline of Kanara and the district of Coimbatore. This was not merely a land grab, it was a strategic masterstroke. By taking the coast, the British completely encircled Mysore, cutting it off from the sea and, crucially, from any hope of French assistance. The dream of a French-Indian alliance, which had kept British governors awake at night for decades, died with Tipu Sultan. Far away in Egypt, Napoleon Bonaparte was waiting for a signal from Mysore, a sign that a second front could be opened against the British in India. That signal would never come. The victory at Seringapatam severed the French connection once and for all. The tricolour would never again pose a serious threat to the Union Jack on Indian soil. In the centre of this geopolitical restructuring was the restoration of the Wadayars, the ancient Hindu dynasty that Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan had displaced. The British placed a 5-year-old boy, Krishnaraja Wadayar III, on the throne of a truncated Mysore. It was a perfect piece of political theatre. The British could claim they were liberators, restoring the rightful monarchs, while in reality, the new king was a puppet, bound by subsidiary alliances that effectively handed control of his foreign policy and defense to the East India Company. For the soldiers of the Grand Army, the war was winding down. The heat was still oppressive, but the tension had broken. The great siege guns were limbered up, the trenches filled in. But for Colonel Arthur Wellesley, the work was only just beginning. His governorship of Seringapatam was proving to be a revelation. He was displaying a capacity for detail, counting bullocks, organizing grain shipments, settling legal disputes that far outstripped his military rank. The man who had been humiliated in the bamboo grove was forging himself into a statesman. He was learning that an army marches on its stomach, and that a conquered people are less likely to rebel if they are treated with justice and stability. The Iron Duke was being cast in the mould of Mysore. The final act of the drama played out not on the battlefield, but in the Lal Bagh Gardens, the resting place of Tipu's father, Hyder Ali. It was here that the British permitted the burial of Tipu Sultan. The funeral procession was a scene of sombre magnificence, a strange interlude where the conquerors stood in silent respect for the conquered. The Sultan's body, wrapped in muslins and covered in flowers, was carried through the streets he had defended to his last breath. Thousands of his subjects lined the route, wailing and prostrating themselves in the dust. As the body was lowered into the tomb, the heavens seemed to respond to the fall of the tiger. A storm of biblical proportions broke over the island. The sky turned black, and thunder shook the granite foundations of the fortress. Lightning struck the British camp, killing 2 lieutenants and several sepoys, as if the land itself was firing a final celestial volley in honor of its fallen defender. It was a dramatic, ominous end to the siege, underscoring the superstitious dread that Tipu had inspired in his enemies. For the men who walked away from Seringapatam, the future held vastly different fates. Major General David Baird, the man who had led the storming party and conquered his own trauma, felt slighted by Wellesley's appointment as governor. He would go on to serve the empire in Egypt and the Cape of Good Hope, but he would always remain a rough-hewn soldier of the old school, brave, but lacking the political finesse required for high command. For Arthur Wellesley, however, Seringapatam was the true beginning. The lessons learned in the heat of the Deccan, the importance of supply lines, the necessity of strict discipline, and the value of intelligence, became the bedrock of his military philosophy. The young colonel who had lost his way in the bamboo grove of Sultanpeta Tope had emerged from the fire as a commander of terrifying competence. 4 years later, at the Battle of Assaye, he would crush the Maratha Confederacy using the very tactics honed in Mysore. And years after that, on the rain-soaked fields of Waterloo, the discipline he instilled in his men would break the back of Napoleon Bonaparte. Historians often look to Europe for the origins of Wellington's genius, but it was in the dust of India that the Iron Duke was forged. The fall of Seringapatam marked a decisive turning point in world history. It signaled the end of the company as merely a trading entity and its full transformation into an imperial superpower. With Mysore crushed and the French threat extinguished, there was no longer any power in southern India capable of checking the British advance. The road to the north, to Delhi, the Punjab, and the Khyber Pass lay open. The East India Company had secured the base from which it would conquer the entire subcontinent. Moreover, the technological harvest of the siege changed warfare forever. The Congreve rockets, born from the designs of Tipu's armoury, became a staple of British artillery, terrifying enemies from Copenhagen to Baltimore. The Redcoat, previously seen as a soldier of a commercial enterprise, was now the enforcer of a global empire, backed by an industrial machine that could digest kingdoms. Today, the island of Seringapatam is a quiet place. The breach in the wall has been preserved, a jagged wound in the masonry where history pivoted on a hot afternoon in May. The dungeons where Baird suffered are empty. The Watergate where Tipu fell is a simple memorial, but the legacy of that day resonates still. It was the battle that ended a dynasty, birthed a legend in Wellington, and launched the British Empire into its century of global dominance. The tiger had fallen, and in the silence that followed, the lion rose to claim the world. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.